Our special guest, Tom Friedman, is here. He recently was out with an op-ed. It's called Saudi Arabia's Arab Spring at Last. Details his interview with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammad Bin Salman. Is the New York Times foreign affairs columnist, of course. Tom Friedman is here.
And the author of...
And the author. Oh, look at him, look at him. The author of the best-selling book, Thank You for Being Late, which I'm late oftentimes, people know that. Released in paperback late last month, but Tom is never late. Tell us about this.
This was number one this week.
Number one this week.
Paperback. Yeah.
But nobody, who's counting?
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Now I'll talk about anything.
Congratulations on that. You did have this sit down with MBS, the first interview with him. Just tell us about it.
Well, I put what he had to say, Andrew, in three buckets. Okay, the first bucket was about what's going on domestically inside Saudi Arabia. So you've got this anti-corruption campaign, and you have the consolidation of more power in his hands.
Right.
Okay, where one stops and the other starts, I cannot tell you, but he is the unrivaled power in the land right now. Second bucket is foreign affairs. So we saw him engineer the resignation and then unresignation of the Prime Minister of Lebanon to stop giving cover to Hezbollah pro-Iranian forces there. We saw him lead the effort to isolate Qatar. Right. And generally, he's adopting a much more aggressive foreign policy toward Iran. Let's leave that bucket over here. To me, Andrew, the central thing he is doing, the truly potentially historic thing he is doing, is reversing a trend that began in 1979 in the Middle East.
Right.
So by coincidence, I showed up in Beirut as a reporter for UPI in 1979. The first story I covered was the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by radical Saudi fundamentalists who, for 2 weeks, were in that mosque. They couldn't get them out. And for 2 weeks, they broadcast that the Saudi ruling family is westernizing, secularizing, and diverting from Islam. They so freaked out by that event, which then coincided with the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979 and with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, that they launched Saudi Arabia on a right turn, exporting Islamic fundamentalism around the world and imposing a much more severe reign of religious control at home that fundamentally changed the Muslim world, from Morocco to the border of India. What is going on right now, and this is truly the potentially historic thing, is Mohammed Bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has begun a process of reversing what started in 1979.
Can you put the toothpaste back in the tube like that?
Well, that's a very good question. So, you know, on the one hand, it is of, you know, it's hugely important. I don't think you can put it back in the tube overnight. But I know this: the only way it could even begin to go back in the tube is if it began in Saudi Arabia. See, the most important thing, one of my big complaints about them after 9/11 was, we would come to them and say, bad Claire, you know, arrest him. They arrest him, okay? Bad terrorists, they arrest him. But what they never did was they never took them on ideologically and religiously. They were always afraid to. What he is doing, during the interview, he said to me, do not say that I am reforming Islam. I am restoring Islam. Let's go back to the time of the Prophet. We dealt with Christians and Jews. There was inclusion there. Women, you know, had positions of power. And the potential, because what he's doing is also is giving permission now to everyone who feels that to now come out and say it as well. And what you feel when you're in Saudi Arabia, he's not just leading this from the top down. Whoa, it is exploding from the bottom up.
Can we just unpack a couple of these? I want to unpack the anti-corruption piece first, and then I want to unpack what's happening regionally.
Yeah.
This is Richard Parsons, former chairman of Citigroup.
Right.
Prince Al-Walid was a huge investor in Citigroup, also in Time Warner. He was the CEO of Time Warner. He says there is no transparency. Nobody understands what's going on. It is unclear why or what the rationale is. This is for the arrest of Al-Walid. If you're an investor or business person, you're going to take a step back from the starting line and say, I'm going to keep my money in my pocket. Meaning...
It's a really important quote, Andrew, because I think he's exactly right, which is why in this column I pointed out this is a pivotal moment for, I think, the Crown Prince. If this process of arresting these people in the Ritz-Carlton, these 200 people, if it ends with some form of transparency and is done in the context of a rule of law, I think it will strengthen him. If it doesn't, I think it will weaken him, and it will affect both Saudi investors and global investors.
When you say transparency, you mean, okay, here's what we have on this prince,
right, exactly.
Here's what we had on this prince,
here's
why he paid it back, and there's a formula for how much we took from him.
And Becky, that is not going on now, and I think it's hugely important.
But that's what I was going to say. It isn't going on now. We've heard of clerics and other officials. There was one who seemed to be who was killed in a helicopter accident. I don't know if you heard about this. Literally days after the arrest, and there were questions about. There were questions about was he trying to flee the country? Was there something else going on? I mean, there's a lot of questions, and the question is why. To the degree that he is trying to be transparent and wants to reform things, why haven't they taken a more transparent approach just with the arrests themselves?
Well, I think it's very important. I can't tell you why not. All I can tell you, Andrew, is I'm very worried about that. And I'm equally worried about the foreign policy, which hasn't really worked, I don't believe. And my concern is because I believe that central piece about Islam is so fundamentally important. My fear is these domestic missteps and the foreign missteps will create so many enemies that will undermine what is the really central thing from our point of view.
Let me ask you the other piece, and this relates to ISIS and to Islam and everything else, which is to say, that some critics have said that all of this is window dressing. That we actually had a guest on recently who said that one of the largest sort of ISIS social media proponents is in Saudi. Everybody knows who this individual is, and yet he's not on the list in terms of people who are being arrested and picked off.
I have no idea. This thing's not going to change overnight. All I know is I saw things in Saudi Arabia I've never seen before. Well, let me finish one thing, Joe. Sure. Toby Keith giving a concert. Wait, I said Toby Keith was here giving a concert? I mean, yeah. Music. Do you realize Muzak was outlawed there? You couldn't have Muzak in an elevator. They had Toby Keith giving a concert. They have Lebanese sopranos now giving concerts. They have women now allowed to go into stadiums. Look, all this stuff was long overdue. Okay, women are being allowed to drive. So it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But these are 2 steps they had not taken since 1979.
It's like something that you've mentioned again and again and again was that to change the hearts and minds of people that are drawn to radical Islam, you need moderate Islamists speaking out.
And Joe, it had to come out of Saudi Arabia because they are the legitimate keepers of the 2 holy mosques.
But you, for a while, said, I think, when other people were saying it's 1% of Islam, it's radical, you said there's a bigger problem with...
This came from the core. And unless the core... The way we've presented it, Joe, often in this country, whenever there's a terrorist attack, people say, well, that's not Islam. You know what I mean? Just people pretending to be Islam. Muslim. Well, that's really not true. These ideas, even ISIS's ideas, were connected to the very core.
So this can help if some unbelievably wealthy royal family that's running Saudi Arabia, that can actually help change the hearts and minds of the average.
Because, Joe, what's important, it starts to changes the education system. It changes where money goes to mosques and madrasas around the world. Again, please underline, potentially, all these things. But this is something we have never seen before.
Is it not true so Islam itself is the end result is not a new caliphate? That is not necessarily.
No, one of the differences of Islam is there's no pope. I mean, the ISIS tried to create a pope, but there's no pope today. So the closest thing you have to a pope that can actually have an encyclical and really change how believers think is what comes out of Saudi Arabia.
That's interesting. I'd never thought of it.
And that's why it's so important. And it's so frail. But the thing I really saw there, Joe, which really impressed me, is how much when I talked to young Saudis, this was coming from the bottom up. He's as much leading this as reflecting it. People were
meaning
fed
it's
up.
okay. Meaning it's okay to make these changes that they couldn't make in 1979.
I had a Saudi banker. I had a Saudi banker say to me, "Look, my life was hijacked in 1979, and I know one thing with Mohammed Bin Salman: my daughter's life is not going to be hijacked." I mean, I was blown away about how much of this is coming from the bottom up. But I cannot stress to both your points, how he handles these domestic issues and these foreign issues can really undermine him on what is the central project. And
that's the thing. We should talk more about it. The thing that I'm so just fascinated by is, he has these big wins, big public wins when Trump came over there. And then the second he leaves, then the Qatar situation. He has a big win. He has a big win with all the big investors going over there about a month ago. The second they leave, I was there. He does these arrests, and so it is this, one step forward.
One of the questions I asked him, I just didn't have space in the paper. I said, "Who's your coach?" He's only 32. He's exactly half my age. I said, "Everyone needs a coach," and it was very interesting. He said, "It's my mother, actually." He was actually homeschooled pretty much. His mother didn't believe in Saudi schools, and what he's missing now, and if I could wish for one thing, that we have no American Secretary of State who could be his coach. if I could wish for a Jim Baker to come back, someone who could sit down and talk to him the way Baker used to talk to Bandar, which is, sit your royal ass down here, and I'm going to, you know what I mean? That's what's really missing.
Right.
And so I think there's these kind of impulses and end you up in Lebanon in a mess and in Qatar in a mess. And what he's missing, I feel, as an American coach right now.
New York Times foreign affairs columnist and author of Thank You for Being Late. There's the book, Tom Friedman, #1 this week, right?
Congratulations.
Tom, I want to go back to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Usually we jump all over the globe with you,
please.
but there's so much happening here right now. You made an incredibly important point that the broader move afoot to trying to quash radical Islam is what's happening in Saudi Arabia under MBS right now, Mohammed Bin Salman. If you look at what's been happening on a very specific front with the Sheikh shakedown, that is what has investors so incredibly concerned.
And I think they should be concerned, because again, how this ends, I think is so important in going forward. If it does end with people feeling that there was some kind of legal process and there was some kind of transparency. So I, as a foreign investor, or I, as a foreign investor with a Saudi partner, know what the future looks like at a time when they need private capital. The oil wealth is not going to be able to sustain it. I think it's just so important how he ends this, and how he ends it is not clear to me.
What happens with Iran? I mean, I just want, and it's such an enemy of my enemy situation over there. It makes me think we get closer to the Saudis, the United States, that the Saudis get closer to even Israel. Where does Iran,
so Joe,
the weapons that they don't have, if they ever get them, where do they point them? They point them at Saudi Arabia, or they point them at Israel now?
So,
who's the great Satan?
Basically, what he's basically saying is my elders, my father's generation, kind of blew it. They let the Iranians, he didn't say that as a quote, but the feeling is they let the Iranians basically extend their influence all over the Arab world, and now we're kind of surrounded, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, etc. So he's trying to push against that. Here's my concern. Iran is a pariah state, and over the last 40 years, it's developed the muscles of how to build underground networks using proxies in order to extend their influence. They now indirectly control 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Baghdad, Damascus, and Sana'a. And what's really scary, Joe, they're controlling them wholesale, not retail.
What does that mean?
They're not even paying that big a price for it. So they're using these proxies. So Iran has developed those muscles. What concerns me, Joe, is that Saudi Arabia does not have those muscles. So they're used to writing checks. That's the muscle they had. They're not used to playing that kind of underground game with networks. And there's a real asymmetry there. And so I don't know how they're going to meet that challenge. I think
it's like fighting guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, they don't have that muscle. And so you saw the kind of ham-fisted way they dealt with Hariri in Lebanon, the Qatar thing. At the same time, what really, if I'm an investor, if you said to me, okay, this is a business show, what should worry investors? What should worry investors, Joe, is that between Tehran and Tel Aviv today is only butter. There's only butter. And the Iranians are pushing. They're already got, their Rev Guards, their Quds Force people in the Golan now near Israel. Sooner or later, the Israelis are going to say, no farther. And, there's been a lot of stories of Iran possibly building bases in Syria. If that happens, the Israelis are going to go after it. And there's one thing that the Iranians may be underestimating, that they think they can fight this whole war through Hezbollah and on Israel's ground. Follow what the Israelis have been doing over the last decade. They've been buying submarines. They've been buying submarines, and I guarantee you those submarines are in the Persian Gulf right now, and they have cruise missiles on them. So anyone who thinks this war is just going to be the next war between Iran and Israel is just going to be in the Golan or in South Lebanon, I think is fooling themselves. Wow. And I think it's one of the most dangerous theaters in the world today.
That's like end of days type of discussion.
It's really scary. If you go on, the Israeli papers have been publishing satellite photography of bases in Syria being built. They haven't been occupied yet, but they appear to be being built by Iranians. Now, we've been counting on Putin to restrain them. But I think that's a bad bet. What Putin is saying, I'm providing the Air Force, and Hezbollah and Iran are providing my ground troops. So Putin's extended his influence into this theater wholesale also. And this has enormous implications.
Iran doesn't have the same bottoms-up potential that Saudi Arabia.
It does actually, but the regime's got much more control there.
But isn't it more secular? I mean, there is some fun in Iran.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. It is definitely more open. Women are in the parliament. It's always much more empowered. And the Shia have always been more open in that direction.
But there's no Arab Spring coming to Iran anytime soon?
They've really kept the lid on there. And the IRC, the Revolutionary Guards.
The sanctions being lifted, has that helped or hurt us in terms of what the local population thinks about us?
I think the local population in Iran has always been pro-American. Iran was the only place in the Muslim world that had a spontaneous candlelight vigil after 9/11. They've always been, very pro-American. But the regime's got a tight lid on it. The lifting of the sanctions has given them more resources. Yeah. But they need an enemy, the Iranians, and we in Israel are providing it. But watch that dynamic of there's nothing but butter between Tehran and Tel Aviv.
But the alliances, you wouldn't say, are shifting with this latest move, and they're just.
Oh no, you alluded to it earlier.
But it really is enemy. So
Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt.
I mean, they're sharing intelligence now.
Absolutely,
That's
absolutely. They're in a tacit alliance. Although I think the Israelis have to be very careful, Joe, that. It's still Saudi Arabia. It's still an Arab country. The Palestinian issue is still important. So you don't want to be shoving in their face, we're with the Saudi. It's got to be done very, very subtly, But there is now a tacit Israeli sort of Sunni Arab alliance versus the Iranian Shia.
When you talk about what Mohammed bin Salman is doing in terms of trying to shut down radical Islam, does that mean funding from any place in Saudi is going to get shut down too?
Well, that I think had already started, but now I think it's going to be much more serious. But the most important thing, since 9/11, I have been very critical of the Saudis for never fighting the war of ideas within Islam. We don't have a war with Islam. There's a war within Islam, okay? But no one was fighting it. So as I said, he'd arrest people, they'd round up a cleric or two, but he never challenged their ideas. And what's so interesting about him is he's challenging their ideas. As he said to me, we went through all this stuff about what was Islam like in the time of the Prophet.
Right.
In the middle of the interview, one of his aides got up, goes in the other room, comes back with his cell phone, and starts showing me pictures of Saudi Arabia, 1950, 1960, women in dresses, men and women walking together, cinemas. And so he's taking these guys on at the ideal level. And what it's doing is going to give permission now to everybody else to do that. That is so important. I mean, there's nothing more important than taking this on. Is it going to change Islam overnight? No, this began in 1979.
But in the 1950s and 1960s, that's what led to the backlash.
Yeah, remember King Faisal, I believe, was killed. You remember King Faisal was assassinated. I believe it was because he started TV.
Right.
So who's Russia? Who are they friends with now? They banded together Saudi Arabia with
Joe,
oil, right? But they're Iran.
Yeah, part of me says with the Russians, they won Syria. What's second prize? Okay, so you won Syria. What are you going to do with it now? You know what I mean? But Putin is a kingmaker there now. Everyone's going to. The Israelis have to go to him and say, hey, you better restrain these Iranians. Don't let them get any closer. We have to go to him. Now, we may be keeping some troops on the ground in Syria. There's reports of that. Not clear what's going to happen. But what I see, again, from an investor point of view, if I'm ranking my event risk, North Korea is number one, but Iran versus Syria, versus Israel in the sort of Syria-Lebanon theater, that is definitely high up there. People better pay attention to that. That one can come out of nowhere.
Tom, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. It's always a pleasure.
Great. Thanks.
Congratulations on being number one.
Thank you.
Paperback.
Hopefully we'll keep it there.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.